Sometimes people get the facts wrong, so I'm here to clear them up for you. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. I'm your host Emily, and today we are counting down our list of the top 10 terrifying facts from history the world lied to you about. So get out your pens and papers, it's study time. Number 10. Chinese foot binding wasn't just to please men. Women have historically gone to extreme measures to meet cultural standards of beauty to attract the opposite sex, from wearing tight corsets to walking in heels. In China, this standard of beauty was achieved by foot binding. A young girl's bones were broken and her feet tightly bound so that her lotus feet now appeared small and dainty. In their research book Bound Feet, Young Hands, author Lauren Bosman and Hill Gates revealed that some girls' feet were bound at a very young age, not to catch a husband, but to force them to work. What's groundbreaking about our work is that foot binding was not confined to the elite, Lauren, the book's co-author, told HuffPost. The study, Lauren added, dispels the view that the goal was only to try to please men. The authors interviewed over 1,800 women across China to uncover that foot binding was prevalent among many peasant families to create immobility for girls so that they would stick around and do hard work that their families depended on for selling goods. And I feel like hearing this just makes it even worse. Number 9. Alexander Graham Bell didn't invent the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell wasn't the inventor of the telephone like we were all taught, but he was the first to patent it. Turns out Bell was actually one of several men who were working on the telephone idea at the same time, but he got to the patent office before them. However, in 2002, US Congress recognized impoverished Florentine immigrant as the inventor of the telephone rather than Alexander Graham Bell. The Guardian reported historians and Italian Americans won their battle to pursue Washington to recognize a little-known mechanical genius, Antonio Meucci, as the father of modern communications 113 years after his death. The resolution declared Antonio's teledeforno, demonstrated in New York in 1860, made him the inventor of the telephone in the place of Bell, even though it was Bell who took out a patent 16 years later. It is the sense of the House of Representatives that the life and achievements of Antonio Meucci should be recognized and his work in the invention of the telephone should be acknowledged, the resolution stated. So he didn't invent it, he just made it first. Number 8. Vincent Van Gogh wasn't romantic. The story of Vincent Van Gogh's severed ear is legendary in the art world, but he definitely didn't do it for love or mail it to his girlfriend. Van Gogh cut off his left ear when tempers flared with Paul Gauguin, the artist with whom he had been working for. It wasn't for love, it happened during one of his mental breakdowns. Also, there's a rumor that he ate yellow paint in hopes to be happy. Now this has never been proven, but if he did eat specifically yellow paint, it wasn't to make him happy. He struggled with mental health issues, yes, but he would have eaten it because he knew it was bad for him and he wanted to end his life. He was smart enough to know that eating it wouldn't make him happy. Like, come on. During his time at the institution in Saint Remy, he wrote a letter to Theo. It appears that I pick up filthy things and eat them, although my memories of these bad moments are vague. The medical notes of Dr. Pryron, his physician, revealed that he wanted to poison himself by eating paint and drinking turpentine. That's probably why he wasn't allowed in his studio while he was suffering from his attacks. So no, it wasn't because he wanted to be happy, it was because he wanted to end his life. So no, he did not do any of these things because it was romantic, it was because he was mentally ill and struggling. Number 7. The Wright brothers weren't the first to fly. We were taught that the Wright brothers were the first men to fly, but that is wrong. They did come up with the first truly controllable aircraft, but the real claim for first in flight fame goes to German immigrant named Gustav Whitehead that occurred in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In 2013, Jane's All the World's Aircraft, which calls itself the world's foremost authority on aviation history, named the August 1901 flight by Whitehead as the first successful powered flight in history. Jane reviewed evidence from aviation researcher John Brown that Whitehead may have made one and possibly two flights in a small monoplane of his own design and powered by a tiny motor also of his own design as early as 1901, which was 2 full years before the Wright brothers. Number 6. America wasn't the good guy in World War II. Okay, I know how that sounds, so hear me out. World War II is often hailed as the last war where there were clean lines between the good guys and bad guys. The Axis powers wanted to take over the world, the Allies wanted to stop them. But it's not that simple. American GIs were responsible for war crimes on par with the acts committed by their Japanese and German enemies. For example, in 1943, US soldiers invaded the island of Sicily and ended the lives of at least 77 POWs in what's known as the Biscari Massacre. Even though they were fighting for freedom, these troops threw the Geneva Convention right out the window. GIs were also responsible for taking advantage of approximately 14,000 women in England, Germany, and France from 1942 to 1945. However, things took a truly barbaric turn in the Pacific Theater. Even though it was illegal, American troops made it a habit of taking trophies from dead Japanese soldiers. And not fumbling through their pockets or taking their weapons, GIs actually chopped off ears, pulled out teeth, and took bones as mementos to send to their parents, wives, and girlfriends. Number 5. Residential schools. Many people think Canada is all sunshine and rainbows, but we actually have our own dark past. In Canada, the Indian residential school system was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous peoples. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches. The school system was created to isolate Indigenous children from the influence of their own culture and religion in order to assimilate them into the dominant Canadian culture. Over the course of the system's more than 100-year existence, around 150,000 children were placed in residential schools nationally. The residential school system harmed Indigenous children significantly by removing them from their families, depriving them of their ancestral languages, and mistreating them both physically and mentally. Conditions in the school led to student malnutrition, starvation, and disease. The legacy of the system has been linked to increased prevalence of post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, use of illegal substances, and generational trauma in Indigenous peoples. The number of school-related deaths remains unknown due to incomplete records, but estimates range from 3,200 to over 30,000, and there are thousands of unmarked graves for the poor students. It's disgusting that this happened, and Canada has still not shown how sorry they are for these crimes. Number 4. Only gay men got AIDS. The AIDS epidemic caused by HIV found its way to the United States between the 1970s and 1980s. During the epidemic of the 1980s, LGBTQ+ communities were further stigmatized as they became the focus of mass hysteria, suffered isolation and marginalization, and were targeted with extreme attacks of violence in the United States. This is because it was known as a gay disease, which simply isn't true. Diseases don't discriminate based on sexual orientation, but due to this myth, many people didn't get the help they needed when it came to AIDS. One of the best known works on the history of HIV and AIDS is the 1987 book And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz, which claims that Ronald Reagan's administration dragged its feet in dealing with the crisis due to homophobia, while the gay community viewed early reports and public health measures with corresponding distrust, thus allowing the disease to spread further and infect hundreds of thousands more. US leaders had remained largely silent and unresponsive to the health emergency, and it wasn't until September 1985, 4 years after the crisis began, that President Ronald Reagan first publicly mentioned AIDS. If Reagan took steps 4 years earlier to help and wasn't so homophobic, many lives would have been saved. But he ignored it. As of 2018, 700,000 people have died of HIV or AIDS in the United States since the beginning of the epidemic, and nearly 13,000 people with AIDS in the United States die each year. Number 3. Slavery wasn't just in the South. Though school taught us something different, Southerners were not the only ones who owned slaves in the United States. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington told Northern and Southern colonists that we must fight the British so we don't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. By 1804, slavery was abolished in the North, but not all at once. Some states left in provisions to slowly free slaves over time, and by 1840, Connecticut still had 17 slaves listed on the census. In New York City, the situation was especially shameful. A fifth of the city's population was slaves in 1740, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. 42% of residents owned slaves, according to the New York Public Library. 42%. 40%. Slave labor built much of the city, and although they didn't have to work on plantations, they were still considered property to be bought, sold, and used. Number 2. The truth about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving didn't start off happy like it is now. According to Ramona Peters, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe's tribal historic preservation officer, quoted in the Indian Country Today media network, President Lincoln promoted the celebration of a happy meal between the Pilgrims and the Indians to create a feeling of harmony and bring together a country after the Civil War. But there was nothing harmonious about how the Thanksgiving holiday came about, as it resulted in the death of an entire Indian tribe. In 1636, when a dead man was discovered in a boat in Plymouth, English Major John Mason and his soldiers blamed the Piquet Indians. They then ended the lives of 400 of them in retribution, including women and the young. The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Newell, proclaimed, "From this day forth shall be a day of celebration and thanksgiving for subduing the Piquets." So yeah, it wasn't at all happy, it was dark. Really dark. And coming in at number 1 is Gandhi wasn't as great as he seemed. Gandhi inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world, but most of us don't know that Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male bodybuilder before he got involved in British-Indian relations. Now, if Gandhi was gay, who cares? But Gandhi tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing. And to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he would sleep in bed naked with young women, including his grandnieces. But worse than his sexual hypocrisy was his terrible racism. Gandhi may have wanted India freed from British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the rigid caste system of the nation. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were led to a lower caste jail for protesting. "We could understand not being classed with whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. They are as a rule uncivilized, the convicts even more so. They're troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals." When asked about Indian views on race versus white South Africans, he wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do." Although Gandhi did bring some good to the world, it's important to note that he wasn't as great as he seemed, and people need to know this. Well, that's all for our list of the top 10 terrifying facts from history the world lied to you about. Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and hey, why not like and subscribe while you're down there? I'm your host Emily, and we'll see you next time. Peace.